to you, and I'm just going to switch
Okay.
chairs.
Well, thank you very much, Pippa, and thanks very much for the very kind invitation. As Pippa mentioned, this is really a comparative project with Stephen White, and we're interested in particular in patterns of voting and political behaviour across the post-communist democracies. We're particularly interested in Russia, but we also cover Belarus, Ukraine, and also to some extent Moldova. And we've been running surveys in these countries for some time. The starting point for all of this is really 1990 and the collapse of communism, and there was an assumption then that once communism collapsed, democracy would automatically take root, all the vestiges of authoritarianism would disappear, democratic institutions would flourish, and so on. And the argument was made that this would be very like Spain and Portugal in the middle 1970s, that this would be almost an automatic process of democratic consolidation. Now, of course, what has happened is democracy has stalled in most of the post-communist countries, and indeed in a lot of them, as I'll show, democracy has actually gone backwards. So this transition that everybody predicted would happen hasn't occurred. And on top of that, there's a degree of rampant corruption across all of the societies, regardless, in fact, of whether or not they're members of the EU. In fact, two of the most corrupt countries in the EU are Romania and Bulgaria. And that has its flow-on effect through to elections and what I'll be talking about in terms of electoral integrity. So what this paper does is look at the public's views of electoral integrity in those three countries, and we extend that through to electoral participation and democratic values. The data come from 14 surveys that we've conducted in those countries since 2000. We have a standard set of questions which we've asked. In fact, we've been very inflexible about changing the questions, which is a disadvantage, but also a particular advantage when we want to look at over time stuff. There is a fourth country where we have asked some of these questions in Moldova, and we've done about 5 surveys there, but I've excluded that country from here because it gets a bit complicated, and Moldova's got a separate set of problems. The 3 countries all have a very distinct history of electoral manipulation, going right back to the collapse of communism. That's particularly the case in Russia and Belarus, and indeed Pippa mentioned the CSES project, Comparative Study of Electoral Systems. Whenever we had a planning committee meeting, there was almost invariably a fight about whether or not to include Belarus because it wasn't a democracy. We always included it on the grounds that we should benchmark it, but basically it's probably the worst of the 3. So they're really an ideal set of countries to look at the effect of electoral integrity on democratisation. We argue in the paper that electoral integrity is really crucial to democratic consolidation. There's obviously other things that occur in there. Economic performance is very important. If we read the literature, for example, Linz and Steppen, a variety of other works and so on, economic performance is crucial. Having a reasonably resilient economy means that a country can withstand all the various difficulties it's likely to encounter during the period of transition. But it's clearly the case that electoral integrity very directly underpins democratic institutions, and if you don't have electoral integrity, you really don't have the starting point for democratic consolidation. In terms of the literature on electoral integrity, there's 3 main approaches which we discuss a bit in the paper to looking at the level of integrity in any particular country. The first is this one called the forensics of elections, and that's looking at the patterns of formal counting procedures that occur during the course of an election. So it's basically almost election day itself or post-election. There's a variety of works on that, but there's a particularly good book by Peter Ordzhock and two Russian mathematicians who look at elections in Russia and the Ukraine, and by doing a variety of mathematical modelling, they basically come to the conclusion that the results that came out are mathematically impossible. Second approach is to look at electoral rules themselves and to what extent they are manipulated by the various parties and in particular by the incumbent state. by looking at things like who is eligible to stand in the election, by looking at things like access to the media and so on, can actually tell you a lot about the degree of integrity. And the third one is to look at the operation of electoral management bodies themselves. A lot of them are potentially partisan, as I explained, particularly the one in Russia has been highly partisan over the last 10 years or so. And by observing how they work and having various groups go in and so on from international bodies, that can actually tell you a lot about the conduct of the election. The fourth approach, which is the one we use in the paper, which I think is complementary to all of these other approaches, is to look at what the public thinks of perceptions of electoral integrity. And what the research shows there is that there's a very strong link between confidence in elections and support for democracy. And Sarah Birch at the University of Essex has done a lot of research on that, cross-national research. She also finds that public funding of parties tends to enhance confidence, so that's a major factor as well. Slightly perversely, she shows that having an independent electoral management body is actually negatively associated with electoral integrity and confidence, and she explains that by saying that by having an independent body tends to be a marker of a country that's had sustained problems in elections and confidence in elections. And then a third component in the research is the strong partisan element that exists in terms of people's perceptions of electoral integrity, and that's certainly the case in Russia, but there's a wide variety of literature cross-nationally. Chris Anderson and various other people have looked at this, which shows that people's partisan perceptions has a major effect on their attitudes as well. Now, the pattern of post-communist democratic consolidation, as I mentioned, has really been very rocky in a whole series of ways. Early on, the constitutions that were formed in these various countries were actually very positive. They included a whole range of freedoms, such as guarantees of the rule of law, human rights, minority rights. In Russia, early on in the process, there was even freedom of information legislation, much earlier than it was implemented in a range of established democracies. And there was even in the Russian constitution a section which said that domestic legislation would be subject to international law. So all of this suggested that there would be a process of democratic transition that would actually happen quite early. The first elections from 1993 suggested that this would indeed be the case, that there was multi-party, multi-candidate elections, but slowly there was a process whereby doubt started to creep in about the manipulation of the rules and about undermining the process of elections. The Russian electoral system, in its first incarnation, half the seats were single-member districts, half were party lists, and there was a 5% threshold in the party list. Single-member districts were got rid of later in the process, and that meant that there couldn't be independent candidates. It meant that the major parties had much more control, and the single party of Putin, United Russia, was able to control a lot of that. And in fact, I read last week that Putin was talking about reintroducing single-member districts. So some of those criticisms may have got through. Has it been done? Already been put through? Okay. That's why we've got him here. Ukraine had single-member districts to start with, then a mixed system, and then from 2006 they went to a party list only. So again, a very distinct level of party control. Belarus has consistently used single-member districts, but of course it's had the problem of having a very dominant president following a referendum in 1996. The OSCE had various observers in Russian elections starting from the mid-1990s. They expressed concern, serious concern, from about 2003. In the very earliest elections, they said that some of the problems were really only technical, that in fact they were part of the normal transition process and they would be worked out in the course of time. By 2003, they were starting to backtrack on that. And they highlighted the development of what they called a Putinist system that effectively excluded any serious electoral competition. Ukrainian elections are slightly different in the sense there was the contested 2004 orange election, presidential election, when protests forced a re-election, and the pro-Western candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, he was actually elected. Things went back a bit in 2010 when there was a pro-Soviet candidate elected, but basically Ukrainian elections have been slightly better than their Russian counterparts. As I mentioned, Belarus has had a problem from 1996 onwards from the referendum, which was not regarded as legitimate by most Western governments, and the referendum ceded executive authority to the president, and most critically it said there would be no time limit on the time that a person could hold the office of president, and of course we've had the same person in that position since then. That's just a very brief summary of the Freedom House rankings of the three countries, and you can see that Belarus, basically from the very first data that's available in the late 90s, is not free. Russia moved from being partially free through to 2003, and then from 2004 it's classified as not free. Ukraine consistently classified as partially free. Now, it's probably worth bearing in mind that of the original 15 post-Soviet republics, in fact, only the Baltic states are considered to be fully free as of 2012. And of the rest, it's only Georgia, Moldova, and the Ukraine that are considered to be transitional, and all of the rest are considered to be not free. Now, the ways in which manipulation have taken place and can take place in these post-communist elections are basically these that I've got here. Very simply, election rules can be changed to favour the regime. That's particularly useful for incumbents. The Russian electoral law, for example, has been amended 26 times between 2005 and 2012. There was the elimination of the single-member districts and the possibility of independent candidates. There have been frequent changes in nomination rules for for candidates, and there have also been frequent changes in registration of political parties. And at one stage, I don't know if it's still the case, it was a party had to have 100,000 members to be registered. It was about that, wasn't it? Yeah, or I think a very substantial amount of money. So there was real barriers that were put up to serious electoral competition, and these kept changing. Another thing that they changed at one point in the 1990s was the against all clause. So for a series of early elections, voters could cast their vote against all candidates. And by the late 90s, they decided that wasn't a good idea, because in several constituencies, against all won. And in one of them, they even had a re-election and against all won again. So they got rid of that. Corruption within the electoral management bodies has been quite extensive. In Russia, for example, the regime put in place about 10 years ago a person called Vladimir Chernov, who was a close friend of Putin. And he was quoted as saying the first principle of election was that Putin is always right. And Putin actually changed the legislation to allow him to be the executive head of the Russian EMB. Before, it was a requirement that the person had to have a law degree, and he didn't. He was an engineer, so that was actually removed. Restricted access to the mass media is a fairly simple one. In Russia, there is free mass media, but of course it's always in the shadow of the state, and there's government-controlled mass media. In the last presidential election, it was calculated that Putin got more coverage than all of the other election candidates combined in the presidential election. Another way is to pressurize voters. One way that can take place is through mobile voting facilities, and there's been extensive use of those. So a mobile facility can go into a hospital, an old people's home, or it can even go to people's own personal homes, and of course it's free from any form of scrutiny by election observers or something like that. Now, it's probably fair to say this table isn't in the paper, but we used it in something else. The actual evidence for pressure isn't great, and in 2005-2008 we duplicated a question that Richard Rose had asked in the New Democracies Barometer in Russia in 1999, and it was after they said whether or not they'd voted, was your vote made under any form of pressure, and did it make a difference? And what you can see there, the proportion of people who said they did make a vote under pressure and affected their vote was less than 1% in 99, 05, and then it hit 1% in 2008. 3% of people in 1999 said they were pressured, but it didn't affect how they voted. But in fact, it was 8% in 2008. We haven't asked the survey question since. So effectively, the proportion of people that are pressured or say they're pressured is really very small, but I suppose the major point in this is that in fact the trend is up. And we must try and include that question again in forthcoming survey. Ballot stuffing is another frequent method that's actually used. They tend to call it carousel voting in Russia, that the same people just move in a minibus between polling places. In Northern Ireland we call it the dead man's vote. But as somebody said, now with postal voting the dead can vote from the privacy of their own graves. So it's less dramatic than it used to be. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence that there was ballot stuffing in the last Duma election, and there was various accounts of polling stations having 5 or 6 tables, of which the majority would be for absentee votes or for special lists, and in fact the table that was just for residents was actually the one that had the queue on it. And in one of the polling stations 800 votes were cast, but there was only 500 residents of the particular area. So a lot of anecdotal evidence that this takes place. Inducements to vote, that can have various forms. Cash has been used in various polling stations in Tomsk, an oil-rich region. It was the equivalent of about $40 to cast your vote for United Russia in the 2007 election. There was also press reports that in some of the Moscow polling stations, if you cast your vote for United Russia, you could have a free consultation with a gynecologist or a urologist, which obviously would cost a lot of money on the private market. Or in some polling stations, you could get 100 grams of vodka or cheese, no more than 100 grams. And free railway tickets is another thing that has been used. EMBs can produce falsified results, and again there's been a lot of evidence that that appears to take place. There was accounts in the British newspapers and The Economist and the Daily Telegraph after the 2010 election that voting lists had disappeared with officials, and then when they came back there were photocopied versions that didn't appear to represent anything that actually happened in the polling place. Now again, the official view of all of this, of the Russian Electoral Commission, is that when you have 100,000 polling places across 1/7 of the world's landmass, you're going to encounter instances where things happen that shouldn't happen. And their view is that in fact, if you look at the surveys and the exit polls and things like that, the official results are actually quite close to what you might expect. And in fact, in the 2011 Duma election, that does appear to be the case. This is a Levada survey that was conducted among 1,600 respondents about 2 weeks after polling day. It was run by Richard Rose, and we got him to ask several questions for us in it. And you can see that within the tolerances of sampling error and so on, the actual result is very close to the survey result. So the view of the electoral officials is that in fact, sure, there's instances of manipulation, ballot stuffing, pressure on voters and so on, but in fact the overall result remains pretty much what you would expect it to be. Now the broader context to all of this is this real problem about corruption among public officials across the whole society. And I don't think we can really understand electoral malpractice, particularly in Russia and the Ukraine, without understanding the extent to which people have to bribe public officials for services. The most common is health. If you want to see a doctor or a health official and so on, you almost invariably have to bribe them. It's a normal way of doing business and actually getting access to government services. Happens extensively in education. Police are another common source of having to be bribed. Moscow traffic police are reputed to be some of the worst in the world. In 2012, Transparency International ranked Belarus 123rd out of 174 countries, Russia 133, and Ukraine 144. So these countries are really at the bottom end of this in terms of corruption. One of the questions we've consistently asked in our surveys is the extent to which people believe that public officials are corrupt. And you can see that across all of these countries, except in Belarus, in the last two surveys, a majority of people believe that most or almost all public officials are corrupt. And you can see, in particular in Ukraine, this was increasing through to 92-93%, 2005, 2006. Slight decline to 83% in the most recent elections, and in Russia, slight decline over the period, 82 at the beginning, 72 in the 2012 survey, but still, I mean, huge perceptions of corruption among public officials. Now, just by way of comparison, I ran a survey in Australia last year where we asked people to what extent had you been exposed to bribery, had to give a bribe to a public official. And we asked them, had this occurred any time in the previous 5 years for you or a close family member? 91% said no. And in fact, it was only, I think, about 1.5% said this had occurred to them in the previous year. And when we drilled down a bit into that, it was basically mostly local government officials. So that, I think, puts this level of corruption into a bit of perspective. The second question that we've asked quite consistently over the survey since 2000 is the level of corruption since Soviet times. And that's the proportion of people say that it's increased significantly. So basically saying things are not only staying the same, they're actually getting significantly worse compared to pre-1990. Again, in Russia, a slight drop through to 2007, 2008, and then we see quite a marked increase, 10 percentage points. Fluctuates a bit in the Ukraine. Things were getting better through to the mid-2000s, and then quite a jump, and then a slight decline. Belarus is slightly different in this, I think, because they've had such an authoritarian regime for such a long period. The regime itself has been able to crack down a bit on corruption. I mean, the regime itself is corrupt, but they've managed to limit it, I think, to a smaller range of individuals, and it's not as rampant through the public service. Those are the questions that we've asked about electoral integrity in the three countries. Those are the results for the most recent surveys that we have. We basically ask about 4 questions. These are 3 of them. Counting votes, TV campaign coverage, and the local campaign. Now I have a 4th question, which is the representation of your interest in Parliament. Doesn't actually work all that well, and we haven't asked it consistently, so we've limited the 3 questions to the paper here. There are other configurations of these dimensions. The World Value Studies Pippa and I were talking about before, it uses 9 various dimensions. There's an article by Shedler in one of the journals, and he identifies 7. These actually work quite well, and we can form a very good multiple item scale out of them, and the average correlation between the items is in the order of 0.6 to about 0.8, so they do scale very well. You can also see that the patterns are very similar across the 3 countries, so if people think that counting votes is fair or not fair, then they also generally take the same view of campaign coverage and also the conduct of the local campaign itself. Russia is at the bottom of the pile in terms of the proportion of people that regard various aspects of the election as not fair. Ukraine is seen to be a bit fairer, and then Belarus is seen to be slightly better. And that's the pattern from 2000, using a single scale for each country, combining those 3 individual items into one measure. And you can, if we were trying to discern a trend out of that, I guess the trend would be that there's a very slight improvement in elections through from 2000, with the exception of what happened in Russia in the most recent 2012 Duma election, and you can see there's quite a significant drop there. Now, what explains all of this? We've basically got two categories of explanations. We've got people's direct experience of all of this, and the obvious way to measure that is the extent to which they're prepared to vote. Now, we've got an argument in the paper where we say that it's actually very difficult to disentangle this using cross-sectional data because you don't actually know what's causing what. However, when we observe the correlation between integrity and voting, it's basically a negative correlation. So it's saying that people that don't vote believe the election is less fair. Now that actually fits in with a lot of the international literature by Andre Blay and various other people, which shows that people that participate in elections actually are more satisfied with democracy and so on. But what it suggests to us is that turnout is probably a consequence of integrity, not a cause. Now, all of this is a fairly fine theoretical judgment because we can't actually measure it. We don't have panel data, we only have cross-sectional, but that's the way we treat it in the paper. So that leaves us with a range of indirect experiences. We basically test 4 of these here. The first one is that there's widespread corruption across society, which we've seen in the previous graphs. Second one is that people have experience with other democracies. Russians are travelling a lot more than they used to. They're much more affluent. They're travelling to Western countries, even to the United States and so on. And we've seen that in the surveys quite consistently through from the late 90s, that there is much more travel to a range of countries. So the idea is that people comparing their own flawed democracy to what they see overseas, and then that's motivating them to see their own elections as being essentially unfair. The third hypothesis is that it's to do with mass media exposure, that they're getting a lot of these cues from television, newspapers, things like that, and this is forming their views of the election. And again, you've seen from the table I showed you earlier that people really don't have too much direct experience of electoral irregularity themselves, but their perception may be entirely different, and they may get that through the mass media. And then the fourth hypothesis is that they would see democracy as an ideal, and then the idea would be they compare their own to that and see it as substantially wanting. And that's the basic table that tests those 4 hypotheses in the 3 countries. What we use here is this combined scale as the dependent variable. It's measured from 0 to 10. 0 is least fair, 10 is most fair. It's a regression analysis, so these are the partial coefficients which show the unit change in those variables which matches a unit change in the dependent variable. And these coefficients here are the standardized coefficients which show the relative weight of the various variables in the equation. And most of these are measured, well, sort of 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. That's 1 to 4, that's 1 to 4, that's 0 to 3. And I should probably say that the countries we cover there, the Baltic states, Poland, and the United States, not ideal, but those were the ones that were covered consistently in the surveys. This is 1 to 4, that's whether you not had a European identity and how strong that was. And then we've got 2 measures of the frequency of reading national newspapers, watching national TV, a measure of whether or not they believe democracy is the best system or the only game in town, and then we've got a range of control variables. What this basically shows is that we actually know a reasonable amount about what goes on in Belarus, so we've got quite a high R-squared. We don't know a terrible lot about the other 2 countries. We're only explaining 7% of the variance in Russia and also 7% of the variance in the Ukraine. It suggests that of the major factors, corruption is a very distinct thing. Not in the Ukraine, but in Russia and Belarus. If you believe that there's widespread corruption in the society, things have got worse than Soviet times, then you certainly believe that that's the case for elections as well, that they also are corrupt. There's a bit of effect for travelling to democracies in Belarus, but there's nothing elsewhere in European identity. It doesn't matter anywhere. The second big thing after corruption is the mass media. And you can see that there's a quite consistent effect there across all 3 countries for watching national television. No effect for watching national newspapers. And we do have radio in the surveys. We didn't include it because it doesn't actually matter, and radio is not a major factor in these countries. And then also, viewing democracy as the best system actually matters to your perception of electoral integrity as well. And then there's a variety of effects there for the control variables, not much in the Ukraine, mostly in Belarus. So 3 of the 4 hypotheses find some support in the data. And then the final part of this is to look at the effect of perceptions of electoral integrity on people's democratic values and their propensity to turn out to vote. And there is a literature which shows there is a significant effect of people's perceptions of the election on whether or not they turn out to vote and the strength of partisanship. And we include that as a dependent variable, and then we also include 3 democratic values. Now again, these are probably not the best democratic values you'd include if you had a free rein, but these were the ones that were asked across the 3 surveys consistently, so basically we're limited to those. The first one is that voting represents a duty, and it's scored on a Likert scale, strongly agree, strongly disagree. Elections can influence government, again a strongly agree, strongly disagree question. And then we have a measure of external political efficacy that individuals can influence government. Now, when we calculate that, we've done it in the form of path models. I'm not entirely sure this is the best way to do it, and I might rethink this a bit next time round. But what we really wanted to do was try and show the direct and indirect effects of these things. So we're interested to see what effect does electoral integrity have on democratic values, and then what is the combined effect of democratic values and electoral integrity on whether or not people turn out to vote. And what you can see in all of these figures, these are standardized coefficients, so they're showing you the weight of the various paths here. There's very substantial effects from electoral integrity through to democratic values, and as we'd expect, things like duty to vote, you see very strong effects in all 3 countries. Elections influence government, again, there's very strong effects. The interesting thing is that where there's a direct effect between electoral integrity and whether or not people turn out to vote, it's relatively modest. That's 0.14, though it's over 2 categories, and that's 0.08, so it's relatively small compared to the other ones. And there is no direct effect here in Ukraine. So to the extent that democratic electoral integrity matters in all of this in terms of electoral participation, it flows through people's sense of democratic values, their democratic political culture, and it's much, much less of a direct effect. And then just finally, to conclude, the findings I think are pretty consistent across all of the countries. We do find an effect for electoral integrity on turnout, but it's via these other things. It's via what people think about the democratic system as a whole. A lot of this measures what expert judgment shows, and again there's quite a bit of literature on that. I suppose the major thing that we've identified in the paper, which I think is possibly the most important, is this very strong effect for corruption, and whether or not you regard corruption as being a widespread characteristic of your society, that really does affect your perception of the system as a whole. And if we see that as the major driver behind all of this, then it's actually going to take a lot of time to fix, because you're talking about generational effects. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Ian. Graeme, over to you for your thoughts and feedback.
Thanks, Pippa. I find that a really interesting paper. There are lots of provocative issues there and lots of interesting data. I think I want to basically make five points. Some will just be a comment on something that's appeared, and in some ways the most important one I think is the last one. The first point is that I was actually interested that you excluded Moldova from your set of 4, because in many ways Moldova is probably the most democratic of the 4 of them. So if what you're looking at is the role of elections in the consolidation of democracy, I would have thought that Moldova was actually a good one to use to compare with the other three. And also in that vein, you started out by categorising them all as post-communist democracies, whereas actually I think there would be a considerable argument about that categorisation, and I think that was implicit actually in what you said. Second point is just about the OSCE. You made the argument that the OSCE believed that doubts, or that the OSCE began to have doubts about the integrity of the electoral process from about 2003 onwards. What that shows is more about the OSCE than it does about the Russian electoral process. I mean, in 1993, the first competitive election, what you had was a number of political parties banned by the president from running. Can't get much clearer sense of putting constraints upon electoral freedom to participate. And of course, in 1996, in the presidential election, what you had was a massive overspending on the part of Yeltsin and his crew, to such an extent that many people argued then, as well as now, that Yeltsin had in fact bought the election. So, I mean, I think that there have been doubts about the integrity of Russian elections right from the outset, and that they aren't something that came in later. And of course what this means is that in a sense the rot didn't set in when Putin came to power. All Putin did was to build on the foundations that Yeltsin had already made. Now that's not an argument that many in the West like because of the support that they had for Yeltsin, but that is actually, I think, a much more accurate view of the case. And certainly to describe the problems of 1993 and 1996 as really technical problems, which I think you said was the OSCE's term, strikes me as a bit odd. Third, you distinguished in passing, I'm going to use my words rather than yours, you distinguished in passing between fraud that is actually takes place on the day of the election in terms of the balloting, the counting of votes, pressure on voters, that sort of thing. You distinguish between that on the one hand, and on the other hand, what I'd call tilting of the electoral arena. And this is what you were referring to when you talked about electoral rules and the manipulation of them. And in many ways, I think in these sorts of systems, fraud is much less important than this tilting of the electoral arena. And that when you get a situation in which a party suffers a major rebuff in the polls, as United Russia did in 2011, that's a function not of the fraud on the day, but a function of the lead into the elections and the way in which the structuring of the electoral process, if you like, wasn't done as efficiently by the regimes that had been in the past. So I think it's an important distinction between fraud on the day and the way in which the whole electoral arena is tilted in favour of the incumbents. Fourth, I was really struck by your graph about perceptions of electoral fairness, and that elections in Belarus were perceived as being fairer than in either of the other two. Now that just strikes me as being bizarre. I don't know what's bizarre about it, whether it's the actual views of the residents of Belarus or whether there's something else going on here, but it just struck me as being, well, bizarre, odd. So I'd actually be interested to hear what you think about that. And finally, the argument about how people see the system and what they use to evaluate it. And you talked about democracy as an ideal and the experience of elsewhere. I think they're both important, but I think what's also important is the notion of democracy that people have. And if you look at the Russian data, for example, something like 60% in a survey undertaken by the Levada Centre said that they should have democracy that's consistent with Russian traditions. That's actually a combination of consistent with Russian traditions and democracy like the Soviet one. But if you put them together on the assumption of Soviet ones, it comes out to about 60%, so just short of 2/3 of the population. Furthermore, if you look at the question about a strong hand, and when the Russians ask about a strong hand, they mean a government, usually with an individual who's prominent who will cut through the rules to do whatever is necessary. And it's usually seen as being inconsistent with at least liberal democracy. So in relation to a question as to whether there were ever any circumstances upon which a strong hand was necessary, only about 30% said never, or it was difficult to answer. In other words, 70% of the population said that they thought that the strong hand, authoritarian leadership perhaps, could be necessary at some times. Some of them, I can't remember the proportion, said it was needed all the time, of course, but what that suggests is that the view of democracy that very many Russians have is not the liberal democratic view, and it may not be the view that is consistent with an electoral system which functions in the way in which we're used to looking at it. So that in that sense, it may be that for a large proportion of the population, the democracy that they've got, if you like, is the democracy that they want. And yes, they might see the electoral system as not having a great deal of integrity, but hey, that's what we've got. This is the way we've done it in the past. This is the way we'll do it in the future. So in that sense, if that's accurate, the difficulty in bringing about change that you talked about right at the end is even greater than perhaps your figures would suggest.
Thank you so much, Graeme, for really helpful.